right, we're in 2 Kings 4 toward the end of the chapter, verse 38. 2 Kings 4:38 is where we will pick up. So you remember we're still in this section where Elisha is basically established as the new Elijah, the new prophet of God. And last week he raised the Shunammite son, and promised that she would have a son, and then he dies and then raises him from the dead. And there are some things about that account, remember we said were, I don't know if peculiar is the right word, but a little different than we would expect with a miraculous encounter. And so now where we pick up, I want us to read this account, first of all, of some stew that goes bad. And last week I said I wanted you to think about this a little bit more as we try and consider how to think through texts and think through being able to read a commentator and being able to weigh what it is that they're saying. Because there are some things that are said about this text, and we have to kind of stop and slow down a little bit and really pay attention to the text and think deeply on the text more than just a surface reading, I'll say that. So let's begin, let's just read verses 38 to 41, and then we'll come back around. It says, "And Elisha came again to Gilgal when there was a famine in the land. And as the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his servant, 'Set on a large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets.' One of them went out into the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine and gathered from it his lap full of wild gourds and came and cut them up in the pot of stew, not knowing what they were. And they poured out some for the men to eat, but while they were eating the stew, they cried out, 'O man of God, there is death in the pot,' and they could not eat it. He said, 'Then bring flour,' and he threw it upon the pot and said, 'Pour some out for the men, and that they may eat,' and there was no harm in the pot." So, backing up, we'll get to our question here in a little bit about the death in the pot. So, in Gilgal, there was a famine in the land. Gilgal, you remember, is a place that was part of the circuit of the prophets. There's a famine in the land. Whenever you see a famine, especially in the Kings, what's one of the first things you should think? Why does God send famines? In this time, I'm not talking about today, in this time period, why does God send famines? Punishment. It was part of the curses of the law, Deuteronomy 28. And so God is obviously punishing Israel at this point with a famine. And it says the sons of the prophet, you remember the schools of the prophets, is what that has reference to. They were sitting before him. Now, when you look at this phrase, sitting before him, it's used 3 times in Ezekiel. And as it's used in Ezekiel, there is this reference to people sitting in front of Ezekiel as he gets ready to prophesy. And so that has led most to conclude, and I think the conclusion is probably pretty correct, that what this means is that the sons of the prophets were sitting before Elisha. Basically, he was teaching them. They were in class, so to speak. And as they were in class, he orders a servant to go and to cook, whether this be lunch or supper, we're not told exactly, but to go and to cook some stew for them. So one of the servants, they go out into the field, verse 39, and they gather herbs and found a wild vine. And so he gets all kinds of gourds and he cuts them up in the pot of stew, not knowing what they were. And so they pour some of it out for the men to eat. But while they were eating the stew, they cried out, "O man of God, there is death in the pot." And they could not eat it. All right, so let's think through this for a minute. What does it mean that there is death in the pot? Okay, it was bad. In what sense? Okay, poison. What else? We're not drawing conclusions right now. We're just simply brainstorming. I mean, it's all they had, maybe. Certainly could be. Is it possible they're saying this stuff tastes awful? It tastes like death, like a dead rodent or something? It's possible. Okay, so I will say historically and classically, this has been taken to mean that it was poisoned. That the gourds that he put in were poisoned. What might be, and again, I'm not making a conclusion or giving you an answer. I just want us to walk through this exercise one time. We could do this with every one of these paragraphs that we study, but we'd still be in 1 Kings 3 if we did that. So sometimes, though, I do want to pause and slow down and force us to think a little bit. What might be something in the context that would say maybe it's not poisoned? They ate it and they're still alive. Nobody seems to be dead. Right? I mean, I think that's a valid point that you have to observe. Now, what is a counter to that point? So if you go down the line that says, okay, well, actually, it couldn't be poisoned because they aren't dead. So what's a counter to that point? Okay. After he did something, there was no harm in the pot. Think of, okay, so if the argument is being set forward as there's no way it could be poisoned because these people are still alive, what is an argument that you could push back against that and say, yeah, but it still could be poisoned? Exactly. Not all poison is going to kill you, and you may have to ingest certain levels of it. Okay? Now, again, for some people, this is a frustrating exercise that we're supposed to do because I'm not giving you answers. I'm just forcing you to think back and forth. Okay? By the way, this is what going to school is like when you study the Bible. This is what you do. You sit there with the text and you back and forth, and then when you make, in my case, when you make a fool out of yourself, the teacher corrects everybody and puts it back where it's supposed to be. So there's death in the pot. The other idea, and this is one that was pretty popular in a number of commentators I looked at, just kind of having conversations with them throughout the week studying, and a number of them, I would say actually remember we said classically this has pretty much always been interpreted that this was poisonous. A lot of people now are along the lines of saying, well, actually it was probably just bitter. It probably just didn't taste good. And when he threw the flour on there, that just kind of, took away some of the bitter taste in the soup and made it edible. What do you think? Right. Sure. That's certainly an application to be taken from it. When you think about, well, I'll go ahead and tell you, it is poisoned. Okay. And I think there are plenty of reasons to believe that. One of which is, again, first of all, some people say, well, they don't die. Well, again, you're assuming that all poison as an equal amount is equally deadly. It's a mistake. That's a conclusion you cannot draw from the information that we have within the text. Okay? The second thing, and this goes to the principle of understanding the context of a book that you are in. See, so this is the danger of, so in a lot of debate exists amongst people who preach about what type of sermons should be preached consistently. So you have topically, where you take a subject and you take a number of different passages and you use them. Some say textually, you kind of stay with the text, but it's kind of your launching board, and from there you can go some different places, not as many as in topical. And then there is expository preaching, which means you basically anchor yourself in one text and you live there. And you dissect it word by word, phrase by phrase, verse by verse. Now the reason why that is a debate is because there's danger there is real danger in topical preaching. One of which is you misuse verses, right? So if I'm preaching on a subject and I go and I pull this, and I'm not against topical preaching, I do it too, okay? So I'm just trying to illustrate. So when you have a topic and you look at a number of verses that may talk about that topic, you go and many times what happens is people just read that verse that mentions what they're looking for. The only problem with that is that verse is found in an entire argument being made in a whole book, in a whole section, in a whole chapter, in a whole paragraph. The odds of misusing a text multiply with topical preaching. So you have to, as a matter of fact, people say expository preaching is the hardest kind. I would argue topically is if you do it right, because you have to understand every verse in every paragraph, in every chapter, in every book. Now, swinging back around to where we are, understanding the context. We have said over and over that what is the writer of Kings doing from 2 Kings 2, about verse 15, all the way up to this point, and will continue to do. What is he trying to show when he's writing? He's painting a picture of Elisha as who? Elijah. Okay? And in this whole section, from chapter 2 on through, what have we been reading about over and over and over again? Think broadly. Don't think on surface. Think broadly. What do all of these accounts we've been looking at have in common? They're in clusters. They're miracles. They're miracles. We're still in the middle of a whole section of Scripture talking about miracles. To place something that is just, okay, he threw some flour on some soup and the taste increased. That doesn't fit with what's going on in the whole section. You see, your interpretation of the text must not only fit with the evidence within those verses, but it must also fit the evidence of the entirety of the section that you're reading. And so if we try and interpret this and make this into some kind of, well, he had a trick in the kitchen, that doesn't fit the flow of the argument. It doesn't fit the flow of the presentation. And so along with, many other things that we could do and say as we walk through, but I simply wanted to remind us that when you look at a text, there's a difference between a lot of times when we look at a text, we look at it very broadly. Many times we don't look at it very deeply. Okay? And I'm as guilty of that as everybody. I have sometimes too much on my plate, and I'm just content to get it done instead of pausing and thinking, because it takes a while to think through what's going on. And but I also pointed out to say this, that when somebody comes up with an idea of the text, usually the evidence within the text, if you'll pay close attention to it, there is evidence in the text that will tell you what is being said if you pay close enough attention to it. And you have to. So when you're doing that, you have to change the way you think a little bit. Okay? So when you're studying a text, you're not just walking through. When you study a text, you walk through the text and try to find the flow. But now somebody has made an argument that requires you to look at that text differently. You have to examine it a little more critically. You have to stand outside of it instead of within it and start paying attention to all the details and how they speak to what is being put forward. Okay? And so, anyway, that may not make sense to anyone, but I do want us to know that it's important that we learn how to do this, that we learn to think through things, that just because somebody says something doesn't make it right. It doesn't matter how smart they are. Okay? We've got to be able to look and to reason through and see if something is holding up to the evidence that's presented in front of us. Okay? And that's just one of tons of things we could talk about. So here he is, death in the pot. He makes it go away, and now everybody eats and everyone is happy. So with that in mind, let's move quickly to the next one. Verse 42, a man came from Baal, Shalitia, which is most likely in Ephraim. We don't really know exactly where it is. So he was bringing the man of God, that's Elijah, or Elisha. He was bringing bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, give to the men that they may eat. So he's bringing his first fruits. So I'm in the Old Testament and I hear about first fruits. Where does my mind go? I'm sorry? Tithing? Yes. Feast of first fruits. Their tithe and that whole feast, which later became Pentecost, Acts chapter 2. And so there's a feast involved where you bring the first fruits of your field to God in the temple. So why is he bringing it to Elisha and the school of the prophets? Okay, so think through that. The answer to that question is seen in a couple of ways. Number one, we're in the northern tribes of Israel, and they don't migrate across the border anymore. So taking it to the temple is really kind of out of the question. Okay, so their options are, they can either not take it at all, just kind of keep it to themselves, or they can donate it or give it to the false gods in Dan and Bethel, or they can give it to the prophet and the prophets who are trying to save Israel. And that's what he's doing. He's in a way protesting. It shows you that even though a lot of Israel was corrupt, not everybody was corrupt. Okay? Not everybody was involved in the idolatry. There were plenty of people who didn't accept the idolatry, even though it was so prevalent. And the fact that he brings this to them shows his protest of that idolatry. And so he says, give it to them that they may eat. But his servant said, how can I set this before 100 men? So he repeated to them, give them to the men that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left. So he set before them, and they ate and had some left according to the word of the Lord. So God takes, and this is something we've seen happen several times, especially with the two widows in Elijah's lifetime, and then in the first part of chapter 4, where they take the oil and God multiplies the food. But when you read about the latter end of that, when he says, give it to them and you'll eat, they will eat and have some left, what does that make you think of? I'm sorry? Loaves and fishes. Jesus feeding multitudes. He does on a couple of occasions in his public ministry. And so we see them multiplying this food. Now again, I don't know exactly what this looks like. I kind of wish I did. I'm a very visual learner. I like to see things happen. Okay? So when I'm studying, I like to put myself in the location, the people, see the conversations, imagine. You follow them under a bunch of different rabbits in that. in that thing. But when it comes to miracles, I obviously have a hard time with that. I've never seen one. I don't know what it looks like. With the loaves and the fishes, what did that look like? Jesus broke bread and he handed it. Did they keep multiplying, like he just kept pulling out of the basket and there was something always there? Or did he break the bread and hand it and then you look down and it automatically, I don't know what it looked like. But he certainly did it. And that's what we're looking at here. God is providing. And so he's putting himself again in this line with Elijah and providing for the people of God. Yes, sir. Which verses are we at? Probably. It's probably just a lot of words are inserted. Don't take that the wrong way, by the way. Doesn't mean people add to the Bible. Which version are you reading? Okay. I would have to look at King James and see how it all flows. The ESV reads very differently from what I'm hearing you say. They shall eat and have some left, not that people are leaving. Yes. And a lot of that has to do with a question we answered a few Sunday nights ago about translations and philosophies, and you start to see some of that play out. We'll see it again in 2 Kings 5 when you look at the way the King James renders something and the way other more modern translations render it. And it has to do with really an advancement that we've made in some areas. But that's just a little difference there. All right. Let's look at chapter 5 or get started. So this is probably the most famous story that people recognize from the Kings. And that is the healing of Naaman and his leprosy. How many people have ever heard somebody preach on 2 Kings 5, Naaman and his leprosy? Nobody? Okay. It's a fairly normal sermon. A lot of people use it in preaching about baptism. And there's a lot of universal agreement amongst people who disagree about what baptism is for and how it should be done, that there are a lot of pictures of baptism that are taking place in here. And I think that's certainly an accurate thing. But I asked that question to wonder, because it kind of helps me understand where we all are as far as sometimes we hear a text taught or preached a certain way for so long, we think that's all that's in the text. And usually there's something even bigger. I'm not saying that to preach baptism from this text, which I have done, is a bad move. I'm saying it's a sub-move in a much bigger argument that is being made here. So let's just look at verses 1 and 2, because I don't think we're going to get past those if we think through some of these things. So it says, Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now the Syrians on their raids had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. Okay, so in 5, 1 and 2, what you've got is a major juxtaposition. You've got a man who is powerful, wealthy, he's the captor, and then you've got a little girl, a young woman who is a servant, who is a captive, who is a Jew, he's a Gentile. There is a clear contrast between these two people, okay? Now, it says when we're reading about Naaman that he's the commander of the army of the king of Syria, which we've already met them before. You remember 1 Kings 19, 1 Kings 22. When Ahab dies, they're going to war with Syria. Ahab has a chance to kill the king of Syria in 1 Kings 19 and does not. And for that reason, he dies in chapter 22 at their hands. So he's the commander of a very powerful army. He's a great man, the text says, the ESV reads, a great man with his master and in high favor. So he is well looked upon by the people in power. Because, the text says, by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. Now there are a couple things going on here. Number one, what battle this is talking about, we simply don't know. Some suggest that maybe it's 1 Kings 22, that same battle. And that's certainly possible. It could just be a series of raids. You remember how does the verse 2 say this little girl came to work for him? They went out on raids. Raided cities, killed people, stole goods, stole people. And so it could be just through a series of raids that she had come. But also pay attention to this, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. But who were God's people? Israel. So why is he giving victory to Syria? He's using them. They're sinning. Israel is in sin. And it also shows, by the way, that God is in sovereign control over all the nations, which has been an argument from the kings, the writer of the Kings has been trying to make, because everybody has, it's hard for us to imagine because we've grown up in a monotheistic culture. We believe in one God. We believe in the one God, the creator of the universe, who's in control of all things. It's hard for us to understand and to grasp polytheism, or henotheism as it is called, where you have this basically pyramid of gods. You've got a God that you set at the top, and then you've got all these little ones beneath it. And so this is an argument being made that the God of Israel is actually the only living God. He's the one that controls all nations, not just borders, which is how they thought the gods operated. Now, it says he was a mighty man of valor. That phrase can be translated in a number of different ways, but in the context, it probably makes the most sense to say he was a great warrior. But then it adds this one caveat, but he was a leper. Okay, let's think about leprosy for a minute. When you hear the word leprosy, what comes to your mind first? Okay, bad disease. Okay, being excluded, that was part of the law's provision there. When you think about the disease itself and what it does to the body, what is it that we most commonly hear when we hear a discussion of leprosy? Lose limbs. Most of the times it's equated to modern-day Hansen's disease. In some cases, that would be a correct conclusion. What we have to be careful of is not taking every time we see the word leper and equating it to Hansen's disease, where you have a breakdown of things going on in your body, where you can lose feeling. It attacks your nervous system and takes away your feelings, and so you can lose limbs and not know it. You can burn off a hand and not know it. You can do all those things, and there are certainly lepers like that are mentioned in Scripture. But the word for leprosy, the word translated leper, is a very generic term. It's not specific. It has reference to a wide range of skin disorders. Okay? A wide range of skin disorders. Not all of them, it's like saying, I'm going to see a dermatologist. Well, it could be something as simple as, I've got a little spot on my arm I want them to remove, or it could be life-threatening, right? That's a pretty big scale. You can go to a dermatologist for a large scale. That's kind of like leprosy. It could be something simple. It could be something extremely complicated and extremely life-threatening. Now, there are some things in this text that give us a clue that this is probably not Hansen's disease. This is probably not the far end of the spectrum. Okay? The first being what? He's around other people, obviously. He's still the commander of the army. Later, he's going to be sent to the king of Israel, who certainly wouldn't have seen him if he were a leper at that far end of the spectrum, where there's worries about contracting it and spreading it. White spots is a part of certain forms of leprosy, not Hansen's. Hansen's is more of more of yellow lesions, is the way it develops, I think. But yes, white spots are associated with leprosy, with skin issues and disorders, especially in Leviticus 13 and 14, where the law deals with how to diagnose it, how to deal with it. So there seems to be something going on with his skin. Now, you also have to remember this, and it's nothing against them. It's not saying that they're... You don't want to get, when I say this, I don't want us to get generational arrogance, because so many people have it. We're so advanced medically today, they were just so ignorant. Well, they may not have known some things, but in a lot of other areas, they knew far more than we know. How did they build the pyramids? People still can't figure it out. So, be careful there. Forgot where I was going with that. But anyway, leprosy, they didn't understand fully, and there was a lot of superstition that existed in these ideas, So if something's deformed with your skin, there must be something wrong with you, right? Why is something attacking your skin? And if I rub up against you, if I'm around you, is what is troubling your skin going to come off on my skin and therefore make me have the same condition? And so there's this constant scaredness with any kind of a skin condition that would have existed in their minds. So here you've got him. He's a great man, but he's also a leper. Then you've got this little slave girl or captive girl. Has the second bell rung? It did? Okay, I thought it was the first one. Anyway, sorry. We'll pick up with her next week. We'll pick up in verse 2 next week.